Simon's official line is an accomplished strategy consultant with over 15 years' experience helping high-profile global businesses and brands solve complex challenges through insight, creativity and communications, and his PhD explored digital communications and soft power at the University of London. And Simon's given talks in some pretty important places, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, NATO Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence, and is a member of the Future Foundation, which is a think tank providing fresh ideas and new impetus for public policy in the Isle of Man.
I just realised that's kind of a stamp.
It's on your website.
Yeah, it's a hugely flattering bio to live up to, but I realise it's entirely irrelevant to my talk today.
But that's good, because that's what we celebrate at this festival, is going beyond our little world, outside our normal Russian doll. We spend so much time in our little Russian doll, which is our work or our job or our role in the family. So this is exactly what it's about.
And I've realised that maybe I'm a polymath based on Henry's description.
I mean, so I'll hand you straight over to Simon.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you very much. And what I would say is that, I am semi-qualified, but my undergraduate and initial postgraduate work was literature rather than politics and technology. So I have kind of meandered a bit. But what I want to talk about is some fragments of research notes that have kind of built up over about the last 20 years from my MA days a long time ago, that kind of were able to fulminate in the COVID lockdown. And thanks to, I'll kind of start by saying thanks to Culture Vannin, who were able to kind of allow me to kind of pull some thoughts together earlier this year to publish on their website, because this year marks the centenary of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, which is perhaps his most widely known kind of greatest work. But what I want to do today really is kind of just go through quickly, because I'm conscious that 20 minutes is not a lot of time to cover the span of Joyce's work, and pull out what initially began as a few passing references, and then the more you dig, the more you realise actually that the Isle of Man held, I would argue, quite a significant role for Joyce. And if you look back into his kind of family background and upbringing, you kind of start to see the connections between the dots. So it started out as an initial work for Culture Vannin, looking at the role and the place of the Isle of Man in early 20th century literature, but actually has gone down a bit the rabbit hole of Joyce. The other caveat is, with hindsight, it probably isn't a 20-minute talk, so I'm going to power through, but bear with me, and come and ask questions afterwards. So just a quick whistle stop on Joyce's background. I don't know how many people have heard of Joyce or aware of James Joyce. Considered kind of one of the towering greats of 20th century or modern literature. Ulysses is described as the novel to end all novels, in the sense that the form of the novel kind of ends with Ulysses. Like, he kind of experiments with it and plays with it, the form, so much that anything that comes afterwards is just a pale imitation. Born late 19th century into a middle-class family in Dublin, father's a civil servant, descends into alcoholism, family falls apart, have quite an itinerant kind of later life for the Joyces. Very artistic, very musical. Crucial thing to know is that the family were staunch supporters of Parnell, Charles Stewart Parnell, who was a big advocate for home rule in Ireland at the time, which kind of offered a moderate third way, if you like, for Irish independence. So you can maybe start to see where some of these connections start to build. The Joyces were bitter because Parnell was brought down by an extramarital affair, which at the time was scandalous, although the Catholic Church in Ireland and the British Liberal Party helped fan the flames of that scandal to effectively destroy the Home Rule movement in Ireland. He famously rejects the two empires of Ireland, which is the Roman Catholic Empire and the British Empire. And kind of ironically, because he's seen as this kind of, this godlike figure in Ireland from an artistic and literary perspective, is that from his early 20s he left in a self-imposed exile and spent most of his life living in variously Zurich, Trieste, other parts of Italy, and Paris, where all of his works were written and finished. And he never returned, although there is an interesting anecdotal kicker as to how far he would go to return to Ireland in later life. Major works that were published: Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. I'll kind of go through these, some quicker than others, to get onto the main Isle of Man influence, if you like. So Dubliners was his first published work, a collection of short stories, exquisitely written, whereas Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are kind of renowned for their really experimental writing. Dubliners is a beautiful collection of short stories, very realistic prose, naturalistic depictions of life in Dublin, but very much about cementing a kind of paralysis of this kind of European metropolis as kind of being very kind of backwards and kind of being bound in by Roman Catholicism, by the state of what was possible based on the rule of Britain within Ireland at the time. So it's an exquisite but quite haunting and tragic collection of short stories. The Isle of Man appears twice in passing references in Dubliners. One, because there is a tourist that comes on boat from the Isle of Man, and secondly, because in a semi-famous exchange between two characters, one says, "You should get out and see the world, move out of Ireland and see the world," and what he says, "Oh, well, I've been to the Isle of Man," and the character says, "The Isle of Man, you should try Paris or London," which is not a particularly flattering depiction, because I'd say, "Go to the Isle of Man." And then we get on to the next publication, which is The Portrait of the Young Artist, which is effectively a semi-biographical book by Joyce, who retells his own kind of upbringing, but it's also a manifesto. No references to the Isle of Man, or at least no overt references to the Isle of Man that I've found yet. Again, it's very naturalistic, but it's seen as a kind of like a mission statement for Joyce, where he sets out his intention, or the character's intention, to become this kind of great artist, to transform the world of art and literature, drawing on all of these wonderful kind of classical inspirations. And it contains this really important quotation, which is used a lot in terms of Joyce studies to kind of give this sense of his manifesto. And Joyce's alter ego in the book says, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." Really important, because the argument that I make and that lots of other critics make is that Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake then go on to effectively create a modern Irish consciousness, or to kind of help define what a modern Ireland could be, or perhaps should be, if it was fully realised. So he's done the kind of critiquing of the existing state of Dublin and Ireland in Dubliners. He then sets out this kind of manifesto in The Portrait, and then we move on into Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. So Ulysses, published 100 years ago, February 1922, and again, it's like 800 pages long or 600 pages long, so I'm not going to really kind of dive into the plot, although some would say there is no real plot. It's basically the main character, Leopold Bloom, walking across Dublin in the course of one day. So it's kind of 600 pages, but it sits in one day. It's based, as the name would imply, on Homer's Odyssey. We already had a reference to the Odyssey this morning from Henry. And again, as opposed to being this kind of 10-year epic voyage of a Greek hero, we kind of, in a semi-ironical way, have a one-day voyage by a kind of anti-hero across Dublin. A couple of things to mention is that it's no mistake that Joyce drew on a Greek classical epic. He was really, at this point in time, about cementing in modern literature the fact that Ireland and Irishness had this connection with that great kind of classical civilization. Huge intellect from Joyce, as we'll see in Finnegan's Wake, and the allusions span everything from kind of ancient Greek through to kind of ancient Irish language, music, science, culture. He was, I guess he was another polymath, but really pulling it together into this kind of building a picture of a modern Ireland, whilst kind of writing it into the canon of Western literature, if you like. And this is where we start to see the Isle of Man coming out. And I would argue that when he kind of sets forward this vision for a modern Ireland, the Isle of Man does begin to play quite an important role. Before we dive into the text, I do just want to kind of throw in a few really kind of interesting or esoteric notes. So there's a whole industry around Joyce scholarship, and Joyce famously said that in writing Ulysses, he would keep the professors guessing for 100 years or more. And he certainly has. I mean, it's a huge industry. Conferences throughout the world, journals, publications, books, university kind of centres dedicated to the study of Joyce's kind of four main works. Two things to mention which are really interesting. One is that obviously the Odyssey takes place in the context of the Greek Mediterranean, centres around the Omphalos, the central kind of Delphic oracle, and Homer making his way back to his homeland after 10 years away from Penelope. Some classical scholars have also kind of marked out the dimensions of Mediterranean Greece and kind of replicated it in other geographical locations. The picture is a bit misleading. It's the only picture I could find to depict what I'm trying to explain. But some geographical classicists argue that if you were to translate Homer's Odyssey to the British Isles, the Omphalos, the centre of Homer's kind of journey, is the Isle of Man, which is quite interesting. But a little bit tangential, and we're not going to explore that in too much detail. The other really interesting thing to say is that I did come across a quote by Joyce saying that one of his main inspirations and influences for writing Ulysses was the Isle of Man, the poem The Isle of Man. And I thought, this is amazing. This is Joyce kind of confirming my suspicions, until you turn up that the Isle of Man is actually the subtitle of a poem, a 17th century poem by an English poet called The Purple Island or the Isle of Man, which in effect is about, it's a kind of a metaphorical poem about an island in the shape of a human, and different parts of the island have different organs and represent different attributes. So it's not necessarily about the Isle of Man. But, I mean, the symbolism or the analogous kind of reference cannot have been lost on Joyce. I'm fairly confident on that, as we'll see, given his in-depth knowledge and awareness of the island. What's also quite interesting is that the aim of the Purple Isle was really to kind of talk about creating a modern England or modern Britain, which was defensive and self-sufficient and was based on a totality of the new kind of union. So again, those kind of parallels with what Joyce was trying to do in Ireland surely can't have been lost. So we first get to, we don't first get to see the Isle of Man in Ulysses in this section. There is another passing reference to somebody who decamps from Dublin to the island. But the first and most significant reference is in the earliest chapter, where Leopold Bloom, one of the main characters, or the main character, is with some friends at the office of his employer, which is the Freeman's Journal, which is a Home Rule supporting newspaper at the time. Bloom is an advertising canvasser. His job is to sell adverts to customers. Again, in itself, quite a modern occupation. So Joyce kind of writing in this idea of advertising and consumerism into the novel is also really important. He talks about creating an ad for one of his customers, an Alexander Keys, who was a tea and wine merchant, and actually was a real business in Dublin at the time. But this ad doesn't exist. So Joyce has concocted this. And the idea for the ad, he says, is the House of Keys. The Manx Parliament, innuendo of Home Rule, tourists from the Isle of Man, catches the eye. Can you do that? So he kind of creates this kind of symbolic advert that depicts the symbolism of the House of Keys, and the ad is the House of Keys, but with an added E to represent the tea and wine merchants. So this is kind of what first caught my attention. And as you go through, you start to realise that the symbolism of Keys and the symbolism of the House of Keys and the Manx political kind of parliament do persist. And here's a quote from an academic, McIntyre, who says that Joyce uses a seemingly innocuous newspaper ad to draw a divergence between Manx and political history, to mobilise the Isle of Man's historical geographic associations with self-sufficiency and independence in the service of a critique of the often violent and moribund Irish situation. So it is there, but what's interesting is that this academic talks about making a distinction between the Isle of Man as a self-sufficient, quasi-independent state and the situation in Ireland. And what I want to do is kind of argue that it's not just making a comparison, but it's also perhaps pointing towards a goal or a vision, to come back to some of the keynote. Because what we see is that the newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, which supports Home Rule, its masthead depicts a sun rising behind the Bank of England over the legend Island Nation. And what we get repeatedly throughout the novel is this sense of Bloom following, Joyce says, the Home Rule sun. So as the day unfolds, Bloom's journey follows the path of the sun, which is variously described as the Home Rule sun, in the northwest because it rises behind the Bank of England. So what he's kind of doing is kind of physically within the story, he's following this Home Rule sun around Ireland, but at the same time he's also kind of metaphorically trying to chase down Alexander Keys to confirm and place the advert for the House of Keys. So kind of metaphorically and literally within the book, he's kind of following around this idea of Home Rule and the House of Keys. And so, it's perhaps going a bit more than just highlighting the divergence. It's also about kind of cementing this vision and kind of dream, if you like. Later on in the book, Bloom finally bumps into Alexander Keys, funnily enough, in a brothel. So another connection with this morning's keynote, uncanny. And in a quite dreamlike and very surreal and kind of hallucinatory sequence, which has kind of moved out of first-person narration into kind of third-person, almost kind of, fully dramatised narrative. We see a series of exchanges. I've kind of pulled all these together because there's a lot of very strange and surreal rambling text in between, not rambling, but surreal text in between them. But we see the outline coming back in here, and it's toward the end of the novel, and we see this blend of many of the important figures that we've kind of called out in the initial instance. So John Howard Parnell appears in the scene, and he's the brother of Charles Stewart Parnell, the founder of the Home Rule movement, and he greets Bloom and calls him successor to my famous brother. So Bloom is then seen by Parnell as the new Charles Stewart Parnell, and Bloom embraces him and welcomes him in, and then we see a kind of not an off-stage narration, but kind of context to the story where we say he's presented with a cushion, which is a charter containing crossed keys on a crimson cushion. So it's the kind of keys to the city of Dublin, but again evoking the House of Keys. And then Bloom kind of gives a speech where my highlighting has gone awry in the presentation, unfortunately. But he talks to his beloved subjects and says a new era is about to dawn. Even now we're kind of building the new Blue Musalem, which is kind of a reference to Jerusalem. Bloom is Jewish in the novel, but he then also talks about building a Nova Hibernia, which is a new island of the future. And then Alexander Keys finally makes an appearance, and he yells at Bloom, "When will we have our own House of Keys?" And at that point, we get this kind of very strange conclusion to the chapter with rockets rushing up to the sky, starburst, some very strange situation where a two-headed octopus in ghillies kilts, Busby and Tartan, Philobegs, whirls through the murk, head over heels, in the form of the three legs of man. So quite a striking conclusion to that kind of narrative around the political narration. After this, we kind of go on into the two final chapters of the book. Interesting, which culminates in Bloom getting home to find he's lost his keys and can't access his house, so he can't get into his house because he's lost his keys, and ends up shilling up the drain pipe and getting in that way. But again, that might be stretching the analogy a bit too far. But maybe not, because it is Joyce, I don't know. But my reading there is clearly there's that real kind of strong theme of Joyce kind of seeking out and looking to build a new island around this concept of home rule, and the House of Keys being a really important kind of trope there. Before we move on to Finnegan's Wake, I'm just going to have a little sip of coffee, because you'll see why in a minute. So Finnegan's Wake then was the final book that Joyce published. He famously said, "It's taken me 22 years to write it, so it's damn well going to take people 22 years to read it." There was a story, actually, last year that I found that a reading group in Australia, I think, had literally taken about 17 years to get through the book. And again, there's a reason why that is. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult, some would say unreadable work. The reason being is because whilst Ulysses is sometimes referred to as the day book, Finnegan's Wake is referred to as the night book, and not even academics can't even agree on whether it's in a dream state or whether it's a book about dreaming, or whether or not there's only one person who dreams in it and the rest of it is just kind of a very difficult text to read. But the idea was that it's very much kind of in that kind of subconscious state where characters, for instance, will morph into other characters in the midst of a chapter, or characters will morph into inanimate objects in the midst of a chapter, where some characters actually are represented by multiple people and then will kind of merge back into one person again. And the really crucial thing, and this is kind of quite a powerful argument, is that where with Ulysses, Joyce was supposedly writing Ireland into the kind of canon of Western literature, Finnegan's Wake, people argue, is about him writing Ireland into effectively the consciousness of the Western world, or the world in general. I mean, it spans everything from the kind of the fall of man to Irish mythology, through to inventions like the television, which kind of there's an object that sounds and looks a lot like a television, but kind of before television had been developed. So an incredibly kind of dense and rich text. Again, the Isle of Man does feature. I'm going to try and pick out some of the bits within this. I'm just going to kind of quickly talk about why it's dense. I don't know whether you can see that. If anyone wants to try and read the first paragraph. The book begins, "River run past Eve Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environment." And you might want to read on. It contains one of the longest single words in a novel which is supposedly an onomatopoeic depiction of the fall of man in the final paragraph there. But it's a book in which most or every single word looks like it might be a word in English, but actually when you look at the actual spelling, it often isn't a word in English, but it's a portmanteau word that might be a combination of 3 or 4 different languages. So each word and each sentence and therefore each paragraph can convey upwards of 50, 60 different meanings depending on how you read it. And the argument is that whereas Joyce and Ulysses wrote into literature, here we're seeing him undermine the English language from within and kind of taking the English language and pulling it apart by subverting it into lots of other languages. 10 minutes? I also just want to say a word about the last line of the book, because if you can make it through the book to the final page, you get to the final sentence, which reads, lips, the keys to given, away, alone, alas, aloved, along the river run, past even Adams, and you end up back at the start. So it's actually a circular book that you never finish or never escape from, as you would a dream. So, I mean, it's an incredible book that I will confess I've not read cover to cover, because I was saying earlier, when you read large portions of it, I start to feel a bit unwell. But anyway, published in, as many books were, published in series, and in the first reference to the Isle of Man actually comes out pre-publication, whereby we have a short verse that appears in a serialisation. And again, Humpty Dump Dublin squeaks through his Norse, Humpty Dump Dublin hath a horrible vorse, and with all his King's English, plus his Irish Manx brogues, Humpty Dump Dublin's grandadar of rogues. Which, again, kind of distills the entire book and the fall of man and Irish history into a very simple kind of limerick. I'm not going to unpick it, but effectively, Humpty Dump Dublin, it could be referring to one of the main characters, Humphrey Earwicker, also known as HCE, Here Comes Everybody. It represents the fall of the character who's alleged to have committed a sexual infidelity, but we don't quite know what, which haunts his reputation throughout the book. It brings in Norse, lots of Norse references. There's a Norse captain. Refers obviously to kinks that are English or from the English British Empire. But what's interesting is that Irish Manx brogues, which of course could be shoes, but it could be the language and the dialect that he uses throughout the book. But what's striking here is that Irish and Manx has been conflated, and as we'll see, that influence and connection between Ireland and the Isle of Man is writ throughout. So, first of all, we meet the title character, or we don't meet the title character, but Finnegan. 2 references to Finnegan. One is Tim Finnegan, which was a character from a music hall song of the period, who dies, falls off a ladder, dies, but is revivified at his wake by his friends and family drinking so much whiskey that it splashes on him and wakes him up. But also Finn McCool, the mythical Irish giant, who we also know is the founder of the Isle of Man. So both of these kind of characters play a reference within the book. And we see this quote. There's a few that reference Finn McCool and the Isle of Man. I won't read this one. But effectively what this is kind of retelling is the founding of the Isle of Man by Finn McCool, who takes up a chunk of Ireland, throws it at another giant in Scotland. The whole becomes Loch Neagh, and the chunk of earth lands in the Irish Sea and becomes the Isle of Man. There's references, and there's sexual references and boozy references because the conversation's happening in a bar here. But again, that kind of foundation story of modern Ireland is linked explicitly back to the Isle of Man. And the second question about the book is whether it's wake or wake, because if you've not spotted it, there's deliberately no possessive apostrophe, and the question is it about the funeral of Ireland or Irishness, as we see in the Tim Finnegan story, or is it about an awakening of a modern Ireland based on the myths and stories that Joyce tells? Arguably, it's about the awakening, because if we go back to Ulysses, we find another one of Joyce's autobiographical characters utter this quite famous quotation where he tells a friend, "History is the nightmare from which I am trying to awake." So you kind of see the parallels in Finnegan's Wake, where Joyce is trying to kind of almost rewrite that kind of history at the level of mythology through to kind of politics and legal institutions into a modern Ireland. I'm speeding up because I've only got 5 minutes left, but we also get lots of kind of passing references throughout the book. So a selection here that I've managed to pull out with the help of a website that allows you to search within the text, because finding these in manual text would be incredibly difficult. But what we see from this is that Joyce, I would argue, knew about the island and its history and politics and legal affairs to a minute level of detail. So we get references to Deemsters and to Godred Crovan, to Tynwalls, to Breslau, along with other references, kind of plays on the name of the Isle of Man, often in relation to sex or kind of sexual tropes. So again, what we see is the Isle of Man coming to the fore to highlight perhaps religious freedom or sexual freedom or a kind of an alternative political and legal historical kind of narrative around what Ireland could become. And then finally, we see a quote from Frank Budgeon, who was a confidant of Joyce's at the time of writing Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Also painted a series of 3 paintings that depicted the 3 main themes from Finnegan's Wake. One of the paintings depicts the Isle of Man. And Budgeon has said that one of the kind of main characters, which is a Dwyer grey ass or donkey, which leads 4 old men through the novel, represents, amongst other things, because it also represents many other things, the Isle of Man, once owned by Ireland. So to unpick this, amongst other things, the 4 men represent the 4 provinces of Ireland, as well as members of Joyce's family and characters within the book. The Dwyer grey ass leads them around. The 4 grey men are prone to narrating some of the text, but at times stopping and kind of looking at tea stains on letters and then having a 5-page digression on whether the tea was Irish tea or whether it came from India, and then etc., etc. The donkey's role is to lead them on the narrative and move them through the story till we get to the end. The Dwyer grey ass is named after Edmund Dwyer Grey, who at one point was the founder and owner of the Freeman's Journal, the Home Rule supporting newspaper in Ireland. So again, if we wanted to push this analogy, the donkey in the form of the Isle of Man, named after the Home Rule champion, is leading the 4 provinces of Ireland around the book to its conclusion. And so in my kind of conclusion, with a couple of minutes to go, I'm kind of making this kind of tentative, but I think there's some interesting evidence there that both the later works, whereas in the early works Joyce rejects kind of old Ireland, in the later works he's about projecting a vision of a modern, multicultural, multilinguistic, kind of technologically consumer-driven Ireland, which draws on everything from kind of Norse and Viking legal traditions, religion, culture, mythology, Celtic mythology, and the Isle of Man kind of forms a repeated theme throughout Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake to evoke and kind of give us a direction that this is where Joyce wants or is hoping that Ireland may head in the future. And to come back to something I mentioned earlier, so Joyce never returned to Ireland in his life, but I did come across this fascinating exchange in Joyce's official biography by a friend of Joyce, Richard Ellman, and it recounts towards the end of his life the possibility of that old impossibility, a trip to Ireland. So Nora, Joyce's wife, seriously considered it. Joyce contemplated approaching as close to Ireland as the Isle of Man, but no farther. I'm like, well, if that doesn't kind of cement the fact that Joyce was willing to kind of get as close to this kind of sclerotic state of Ireland as to the Isle of Man, does that not suggest that maybe he felt the Isle of Man was a haven for someone of his kind of vision and point of view? I don't know, but I'm going to suggest it is. So again, we come back to MacIntyre, who says that the Isle of Man for Joyce stands in dramatic contrast to the realities of colonial Ireland, and it's that contrast that Joyce would seize upon. And I'm kind of saying it's not just the contrast, it's almost kind of taking the next step into writing Ireland into this new kind of modern world, using a lot of things that the island stood for and that shared connection that it had with Ireland at the time. So, just to kind of wrap up and get onto those kind of things, that we talked about in the subheading. This is maybe the next step of the work, which is what would Joyce do now? I mean, do we think that kind of if Joyce kind of came back and came to the island, he'd kind of see the island as a kind of paragon of kind of progressive modernity, or has Ireland overtaken us, perhaps? Maybe in some ways, maybe not in others. Do we see ourselves as that kind of? Because reading this, as a Manxman, I was kind of like, this is amazing. My small and as a child kind of quite parochial, insignificant island in the middle of the Irish Sea is written large into some of the most important works of 20th century literature. do we feel that we're kind of living up to that status, and how can we reclaim some of that status? And I'm really keen to explore, again, going back to vision, the idea of an epic imagination. So it's not just safe and sustainable, perhaps, but we need that kind of that next leap into kind of the imaginative realm. What is it that we want to become? You know, who's writing novels now that would explore where the Isle of Man should become in the future, or should grow into in the future? And perhaps we can learn about the future by looking into the past and understanding that journey that, although it took many years that Joyce wanted Ireland to go on, Ireland now seems to have gone on that journey to become a much more progressive and modern state. What can we learn from that? That's the next section, next year perhaps. So we'll get to there. So thank you very much.